Some researchers have gone so far as to describe populations like the Andamanese as something resembling a genetic time capsule, a rare living connection back to a very early chapter of the human story that has, in most other parts of the world, become thoroughly mixed and blended through tens of thousands of years of subsequent migration, conquest, and cultural exchange. If accurate, this would mean that studying the deep ancestry of groups closely, somewhere in the Indian Ocean sits a small island roughly the size of Manhattan, surrounded by coral reefs and guarded by people who have violently resisted every single outsider who has ever tried to set foot on their shore. Scientists studying the deep genetic ancestry connected to this isolated group have uncovered something that quietly rewrites the timeline of human migration out of Africa. And the story behind it is far stranger and far more respectful of these people's right to remain untouched than most documentaries ever let on. The island is called North Sentinel, part of India's Andaman Islands, and the people who live there are known as the Sentinelese. For anyone unfamiliar with them, understand this immediately. Nobody actually knows how many Sentinelese people currently exist, with estimates ranging anywhere from fewer than 50 individuals to as many as several hundred. Nobody speaks their language. Nobody has ever had a peaceful, sustained conversation with them. Every documented attempt at outside contact throughout modern history has ended the exact same way, with arrows fired from the beach and outsiders forced to retreat. This is not simple aggression for the sake of violence. It reflects a community that has apparently chosen, generation after generation, to protect its isolation at any cost, likely as a direct response to centuries of trauma involving disease, kidnapping, and violence brought by outside colonial powers targeting neighboring Andamanese groups throughout history. The Indian government today enforces strict laws prohibiting anyone from approaching the island, both to protect Sentinelese lives from diseases they have absolutely no immunity against, and to respect their clearly and consistently expressed wish to be left entirely alone. Because of this enforced and mutually understood isolation, something remarkable follows directly from it. There has never been a single confirmed instance of scientists collecting and analyzing actual genetic material directly from a living Sentinelese individual. Every single conclusion researchers have drawn about their deep ancestry comes instead from indirect scientific evidence, primarily genetic studies of closely related neighboring tribes throughout the wider Andaman Islands, combined with careful archaeological research and broader models tracing the ancient human migration out of Africa. This distinction matters enormously, and it is worth being completely upfront about it before diving into what researchers actually believe. Nothing in this video comes from directly sampled Sentinelese DNA, because that DNA, out of profound respect for their safety and their explicitly expressed wishes, has never been collected. What follows instead comes from genetic research on their closest known relatives, the Onge, the Jarawa, and the Great Andamanese peoples, combined with population genetics models that trace how ancient humans spread out from Africa across the entire planet. According to the leading scientific model explaining human origins, sometimes called the Out of Africa model, a relatively small population of Homo sapiens left the African continent somewhere between 60 and 70,000 years ago, eventually spreading outward across Asia, Europe, Australia, and every other inhabited continent on Earth. Genetic research studying the broader Andamanese population strongly suggests their ancestors were part of one of the earliest waves within this massive migration. Following a coastal route that carried early humans along the southern edge of Asia, through what is now India, and eventually into Southeast Asia. Specific genetic studies examining mitochondrial DNA lineages among Andamanese populations have identified deep, ancient genetic branches connecting them to some of the very earliest confirmed migrations out of Africa. One particular genetic lineage researchers have studied, known as the M haplogroup and its subclades, appears to have entered the Andaman Islands somewhere between 26,000 and 37,000 years ago, based on current genetic dating estimates. This places Andamanese ancestry among some of the oldest, continuously documented human lineages found anywhere in Asia today. If you find it fascinating how genetics can trace human migration across tens of thousands of years, go ahead and hit that like button right now. It genuinely helps this channel keep bringing you deep dives exactly like this one. Here is where the story becomes genuinely significant for understanding human history more broadly, because groups like the Sentinelese and their closest Andamanese relatives appear to descend from such an early branch of the human migration story, and because they subsequently remained so remarkably isolated for tens of thousands of years afterward, cut off from the genetic mixing and cultural exchange that shaped populations across the rest of Asia, researchers studying their broader lineage believe these populations may preserve genetic and even some biological characteristics, resembling those carried by extremely early waves of modern humans, shortly after our species first began spreading beyond Africa. Related to the Sentinelese offers researchers a genuinely rare window into what early post-African human populations may have looked like. both genetically and possibly even in some behavioral or cultural respects, before later waves of migration reshaped human populations almost everywhere else on the planet. However, this next point matters enormously for anyone genuinely interested in accurate science rather than sensational headlines. Not every researcher fully agrees with this genetic time capsule framing. Some population geneticists studying Southeast Asian ancestry more broadly have pushed back specifically against describing Andamanese populations as untouched. Genetic fossils frozen in time. According to this more cautious scientific perspective, genetic analysis, comparing Andamanese populations to ancient DNA samples recovered from mainland Southeast Asia, suggests these groups share close genetic affinities with prehistoric populations connected to what archaeologists call the Hoabinian culture, an ancient hunter-gatherer tradition that persisted across mainland Southeast Asia for many thousands of years. According to this alternative perspective, the Andamanese Islands were likely populated relatively recently in the broader scope of human migration history, possibly around 16 to 20,000 years ago, during a period when sea levels were significantly lower than they are today, creating a much narrower and more easily crossable gap between the Andaman Islands and the Southeast Asian mainland. This would mean Andamanese populations, while still representing a genuinely deep and ancient branch of human ancestry, are not necessarily quite as impossibly isolated or unusual as some more sensational popular accounts have suggested, but rather represent one regional branch within a broader ancient Southeast Asian population that has remained isolated for a still remarkably long, but somewhat shorter, span of time. This kind of scientific disagreement is not a weakness in the research. It is exactly how good science actually works. Different research teams, using different methodologies, different comparative data sets, and different statistical models, sometimes reach different conclusions about exactly how deep and exactly how unique a particular population's isolation truly extends. What remains consistent across virtually all serious genetic research on this topic, regardless of which specific timeline different researchers ultimately favor, is that Andamanese populations, including the presumed ancestors of the Sentinelese, represent one of the most genetically isolated, longest continuously separated human populations found anywhere on our entire planet. Think about what that isolation actually means in practical terms, stretched across such an enormous span of time. While populations across mainland Asia, Europe, and eventually the Americas experienced countless waves of migration, conquest, agricultural revolution, and genetic mixing across tens of thousands of years, the ancestors of groups like the Sentinelese appear to have remained genetically separated from these broader global changes for the vast majority of that entire time. They continued living as hunter-gatherers on a small, isolated island, largely disconnected from the sweeping technological and cultural transformations that reshaped nearly every other human population across the planet. This raises a genuinely fascinating scientific question. If human brains and cognitive capabilities were already fully modern by the time these early migrations occurred, and virtually all serious researchers studying human evolution agree that they almost certainly were, then a population like the Sentinelese represents living proof that fully modern human cognitive capacity does not require agriculture, writing systems, advanced technology, or large-scale civilization to exist. The Sentinelese, whatever the exact timeline of their specific ancestry ultimately turns out to be, demonstrate that human intelligence, adaptability, and cultural sophistication were already fully present in our species tens of thousands of years before most of the developments we typically associate with civilization ever began appearing anywhere on Earth. If uncovering these deep, ancient threads connecting all of humanity together fascinates you, make sure you are subscribed, because there are countless more incredible discoveries just like this one still waiting to be explored right here on this channel. There is something genuinely humbling about sitting with this information carefully. Every single one of us alive today, no matter where our specific ancestors eventually settled across the globe, ultimately traces back to that same relatively small population that first began leaving Africa somewhere between 60 and 70,000 years ago. The Sentinelese and their closest genetic relatives represent one of the earliest branches to split away from that shared ancestral migration, while the rest of us descend from later branches that continued spreading, mixing, and adapting across every other inhabited continent on the planet. In a very real, scientifically grounded sense, the Sentinelese are not some separate or lesser branch of humanity, despite how popular media occasionally, and quite unfairly, chooses to portray them. They represent one particular thread within the same enormous shared human story that eventually produced every single person alive on Earth today, a thread that happened to remain remarkably isolated and undisturbed for an extraordinarily long stretch of time, while countless other threads eventually reconnected, mixed, and transformed one another repeatedly throughout the long arc of human history. This also explains something genuinely important about why modern researchers approach the Sentinelese with such extreme caution and deliberate scientific restraint, resisting the very human temptation to simply send in a research team and finally settle these deep, ongoing scientific debates once and for all. Because the Sentinelese have had essentially zero exposure to diseases that are common throughout the rest of the modern world, an initial encounter with outsiders carries genuinely catastrophic risk. Historical precedent from other isolated indigenous populations across the world offers a devastating warning here. Entire populations, tragically including other Andamanese groups whose numbers were catastrophically reduced during earlier waves of colonial contact throughout history, have been nearly wiped out entirely by diseases like measles, influenza, or even the common cold, illnesses that cause only mild symptoms in populations with existing immunity, but which can prove rapidly fatal to populations that have never been exposed to them before. This is precisely why the Indian government maintains such an unusually strict policy of enforced non-contact surrounding North Sentinel Island, a policy that stands in stark contrast to how many other remote or historically isolated populations around the world have eventually been approached, studied, and often tragically exploited throughout the broader history of colonial expansion and anthropological research. In the specific case of the Sentinelese, protecting their fundamental right to remain isolated has been deliberately prioritized over the scientific curiosity that might otherwise drive researchers to seek closer, more direct contact. This means many of the deepest, most fascinating scientific questions surrounding the Sentinelese specifically may realistically never be fully answered through direct genetic sampling, at least not without causing serious, potentially catastrophic harm to a small, vulnerable population that has clearly and repeatedly demonstrated their strong desire to remain completely separate from the rest of the modern world. Scientists studying this topic must instead continue relying on indirect evidence, drawn carefully from closely related neighboring populations, supplemented by archaeological research and increasingly sophisticated genetic modeling techniques that do not require direct sampling from the Sentinelese themselves. There is something quietly profound in that scientific restraint, worth sitting with for a moment. In an era when genetic sequencing technology has become so widespread and so relatively inexpensive that ordinary consumers can mail a simple saliva sample away and receive a detailed genetic ancestry report within just a matter of weeks, the international scientific community has made a deliberate collective choice to leave one of the most genetically fascinating human populations on Earth almost entirely unstudied and untouched, purely and specifically out of respect for their safety and their clearly, repeatedly expressed autonomy. So when people describe the Sentinelese as rewriting human history, understand exactly what that framing genuinely means, and just as importantly, what it carefully does not mean. It does not mean scientists have directly studied their DNA and uncovered some kind of dramatic secret hidden deep within it. It means that everything we currently understand about their likely deep ancestry, learned carefully and indirectly through related populations and broader archaeological research, powerfully reinforces just how ancient, how deeply layered, and how genuinely remarkable the full human migration story actually is. Tens of thousands of years ago, small groups of early humans spread out from Africa at different waves and different directions, and one of those groups, against truly astonishing odds, remained almost completely isolated on a small island for tens of thousands of years afterward, protecting their own distinct way of life right up to this very present day. That is not simply a fascinating genetic curiosity. It is a living, breathing reminder that the human story is far older, far deeper, and far more varied than most of us ever fully stop to consider in our daily lives. Somewhere out there, on a small forested island surrounded by coral reefs, a community continues living largely as their extremely distant ancestors once did, entirely by their own clearly and repeatedly expressed choice, quietly holding on to threads connecting all the way back to one of the very earliest chapters in the entire story of modern humanity. Let us take a moment to actually walk through the history of contact attempts with this island, because that history explains exactly why modern researchers approach this topic with such extraordinary caution today. Throughout the 19th and 20th centuries, various expeditions attempted to establish contact with the people living on North Sentinel Island, often through what anthropologists now describe as gift-dropping expeditions, where researchers would approach the shoreline by boat and leave offerings like coconuts, bananas, and metal tools on the beach before retreating, hoping to gradually build trust over repeated visits. Some of these encounters ended peacefully, with islanders eventually collecting the offered gifts after outsiders withdrew. Others ended in violence almost immediately, with arrows fired the moment boats approached close enough to shore. Perhaps the most well-known and thoroughly documented contact expeditions took place during the 1970s and 80s, when Indian anthropologists made repeated attempts at friendly contact, sometimes successfully exchanging gifts from a safe distance, though genuine sustained communication or trust was never fully established across these decades of careful, repeated effort. These friendly contact attempts were eventually and deliberately discontinued by the Indian government beginning in the 1990s, following a landmark shift in official policy that placed far greater emphasis on protecting indigenous autonomy and reducing disease transmission risk, rather than continuing to actively pursue anthropological contact for research purposes. This policy shift reflected a broader, gradually evolving understanding within the international anthropological community, more generally recognizing that historically, contact between isolated indigenous populations in the modern world had repeatedly produced catastrophic, often fatal consequences for the more vulnerable population involved, regardless of how carefully or how respectfully that initial contact was actually intended. The most devastating and well-documented historical example of this exact pattern comes from the Sentinelese people's own closest regional neighbors, the broader Great Andamanese population. Before sustained British colonial contact began during the 19th century, the wider Great Andamanese population is estimated to have numbered in the many thousands, spread across multiple distinct island communities throughout the Andaman archipelago. Following sustained contact with British colonial settlers, introduced diseases including measles, influenza, and syphilis devastated these populations catastrophically. Today, the collective descendants of what were once numerous distinct Great Andamanese communities number fewer than 40 individuals total, according to recent population surveys, representing one of the most catastrophic population collapses recorded anywhere in modern history. This historical tragedy, unfolding just a short distance away from North Sentinel Island itself, offers a devastatingly clear explanation for why the Sentinelese specifically have maintained such consistent, sustained hostility toward any form of outside contact across so many generations. While we obviously cannot directly ask them to confirm this reasoning, given the complete absence of any shared language or sustained communication, many anthropologists, studying the wider historical and cultural context of the region, believe the Sentinelese may have inherited generations of cultural memory and learned wariness surrounding outsiders, passed down carefully through oral tradition, after witnessing or hearing about the catastrophic fate that befell their genetic and cultural relatives elsewhere throughout the Andaman Islands. This context adds an entirely different, more emotionally resonant layer of meaning to their consistent, repeated resistance toward outside contact. Rather than representing simple, unexplained aggression, their defensive behavior may actually represent a remarkably effective, deeply learned survival strategy, one that has successfully protected their population's health, autonomy, and distinct cultural identity for well over a century. Precisely during a historical period when virtually every other comparable indigenous population throughout the region suffered catastrophic, often near total population collapse following sustained outside contact. There is also an important scientific point worth clarifying regarding exactly how researchers study genetic relationships between isolated populations like the Sentinelese and their more accessible regional neighbors without ever requiring direct sampling. Population geneticists frequently rely on a technique involving careful comparative analysis, examining genetic markers found among closely related, more accessible populations, and then using established mathematical models of population divergence, migration timing, and genetic drift to make statistically informed inferences about populations that cannot be directly and safely sampled themselves. This approach, while inherently less precise than direct genetic sampling, still allows researchers to draw genuinely meaningful, scientifically grounded conclusions about broader population history and migration patterns. It is also worth emphasizing that this entire scientific approach represents a deliberate, evolving shift away from older, considerably more invasive anthropological practices that were unfortunately common throughout earlier eras of colonial-era research. Historically, researchers studying indigenous populations around the world frequently prioritized scientific curiosity and data collection over the safety, dignity, and expressed wishes of the actual populations being studied, sometimes even collecting biological samples and cultural artifacts without meaningful informed consent. Modern research standards surrounding populations like the Sentinelese represent a genuinely significant ethical improvement over this troubling historical pattern, deliberately prioritizing indigenous safety and autonomy over the pursuit of scientific completeness at essentially any cost. Understanding this full historical and ethical context transforms how we should genuinely think about the Sentinelese and populations like them. They are not simply a fascinating genetic curiosity awaiting patiently to be studied and cataloged by outside researchers whenever modern science eventually develops sufficiently safe and non-invasive sampling techniques. They represent a living, autonomous community that has made a clear, sustained, and repeatedly demonstrated collective choice to protect their own health, culture, and independence, and that choice deserves genuine respect from the wider scientific community and general public alike, regardless of how tantalizing the remaining unanswered scientific questions surrounding their deep ancestry ultimately continue to be for researchers eager to fully complete the broader human migration story. And perhaps that is the real lesson worth carrying away from this story. Not every mystery needs to be solved. Not every question needs a direct answer pulled from a laboratory sample. Sometimes the most respectful, most genuinely scientific choice is simply to leave a people and the deep secrets carried quietly within their bloodline exactly as they have chosen to remain.